actually remembered to do that. So greetings everybody and welcome to Tomatoes 101. Holding this class in partnership with the Greater Columbus Growing Coalition. You may see a box that popped up on your screen that says consent to record. That is just to get this so that we can host this so anybody who didn't make it will be able to view this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our two hostesses with the mostesses and let them speak a little bit about GCGC before we get started.
Okay, hi, I'm Melissa Fannin. I'm the Secretary of the Greater Columbus Growing Coalition, and
I'm Teresa Martin. I am the President of the Greater Columbus Growing Coalition. Forgot who I was with here.
and we're going to show you this sign real quick. That is from one of our drops. We have these wonderful donations from the Straters Garden Centers, and we've had this for ongoing for 10 years. Our group was started 10 years ago by Peggy Murphy and Andrew Proud and several other, Michael Duty, several other people.
Half a dozen more people.
Right, and so they incorporated it, and it all started, as Peggy would say, with $1 and a prayer back out in the Highland Youth Garden, and it has grown. We now have about 180 members, 35 of which are community gardens. The rest are individual backyard gardeners, and we have these things called Straters Drops, as well as our wonderful meetings, which you need to come to, by the way. We meet the first Thursday of every month, or at least we did until this COVID thing happened. We hope to meet in July. On our website at columbusgcgc.org, you can find our schedule and our locations. And also you can find that on Facebook at the GCGC. So check out both sites. Look at pictures of our Straters drops. We had a drop today in the thunderstorm out at the Kossuth Street Garden. It was fun.
Got to play in the rain.
Play in the rain. We had thousands of flats and baskets and things donated from Straters. They're so wonderful to us. You are welcome to go out tonight, tomorrow. Get yourself some baskets at 641 East Kossuth Street, Kossuth, at the corner of 17th Street. Do not pick up anything from the Kossuth Garden, but you'll see lined up geraniums, impatiens, begonias, things like that. You are welcome to them. We've got to get them cleaned out. We had a marvelous, marvelous delivery today, for which we are thankful.
Yeah, we thank Straters rocks.
Yes.
They're always on the go with us, and they're always happy to keep us busy accepting these beautiful donations. And I thank the garden today. I thank Michael for letting us use his space, as well as the other gardens we go to throughout the year, almost every month of the year, and nearly every week we have these donations. So I'm anxious for the more people to join up with us to help us get rid of these beautiful and bless their neighbors as well.
Yep.
Teresa and Melissa, if you guys want, you can enter all of the stuff that you just said typed into the chat, the address of Kossuth Street, the gcgc.org, the Facebook things, because we're doing this class in partnership with GCGC. They have a class attendance requirement that you attend at least one class, and so this is your class. So we're going to get started right now on Tomatoes 101. I ask that everybody mute, and if you have questions, dump them into the chat box. I will head up into the chat box and address questions probably every 5, 6, 8 slides or so. But let's get started on Tomatoes 101. So tomatoes are a berry, believe it or not, in the Solanaceae family, and that is the nightshade family. I like to say that half of those plants are delicious vegetables and half of those plants are deadly poisons. They like full sun. They can do okay depending on the variety you choose if you pick wisely, meaning that a lot of folks will tell me that they maybe have half-day sun, they're on the east side of the garage, they're on the west side of the house. You can still get tomato production if that's the case. You need to make sure that you pick varieties that mature a little bit earlier, right? So if you're trying to grow like a big Brandywine slicer, you're going to find that that might be a little bit tricky to do because that's 110-day maturity. Something like a first lady or something like an early girl is going to mature that way. And one of the things I love about tomatoes is they come in an absolute dizzying array of different sizes and different colors, from really large ones that are multiple pounds down to tiny little cherry tomatoes that are barely an ounce. When we talk about them, we use a couple of different terms. We'll talk about heirloom versus hybrid, but basically when we say heirloom, we're talking about an open pollinated one where if it's pollinated true, it will develop into the same plant year after year where people will save seeds because that's a favored variety, versus a hybrid, which would be two or maybe more different tomato species that are mixed together. So the end product gets some of the benefits of those various different tomatoes. Maybe they have disease resistance, or maybe they have really vigorous root systems or things like that. And root systems are really interesting in the tomato because they have what's known as interstitial root growth, meaning that they will grow extra roots that will root out of the stem. So a lot of folks, including myself, will plant them a little bit deeper, or will plant them in a trench so that you get some extra root growth out of the stem, which creates a stronger, healthier root system. So the first thing we talk about is trellising and support, right? Because these, in most cases, unless you have like a dwarf one or a really compact bush one, and they make them like that, to get ideal fruit, you're going to put them up in the air a little bit. Believe it or not, as a vine, if you planted tomatoes and you just let them sprawl around on the ground, they would still produce fruit. The problem would be you're probably going to get some damage to them from insects or critters lying on the ground like that. So the different methods of support we talk about are things like cages or stakes. There's a technique called the Florida weave, which is really cool. A lot of folks will do a sort of a trellis where they're going to hang string down, and then they will attach or weave string to the tomato vine so that they're supported. And then I'm going to go over the way that I get my tomatoes up in the air. I use cattle panel. But the picture right there is something that is a very, very commonly used apparatus for getting your tomatoes up in the age, and that's a tomato cage. And they're really, really popular. One of the things that I would caution you about is if you're growing a vigorous indeterminate, and indeterminate means a plant that is going to have a continuous growth throughout the season versus what's known as a determinate that grows to a certain size and then there's a terminal end to that stem. An indeterminate, think like a cherry tomato, think like an heirloom slicer. They're going to grow continuously throughout the season. And a lot of these tomato cages are only like 3 feet tall. My tomatoes are going to go 6, 7, 8 feet tall. And so make sure that if you're going to use a tomato cage to support your tomatoes, you pick wisely in the variety, because a cherry tomato is going to outgrow this cage and start running all over the ground probably about mid-July. So one of the terms that we talk about is suckers in tomatoes. And what suckers is it is a stem that grows at the junction of a leaf branching and the main stem. And it is productive. It's going to grow tomatoes off it. The problem is you can get lots and lots of suckers, and you can have a really, really bushy habit, and that might be good for production in terms of overall numbers of tomatoes. But when you leave lots of suckers on there, you might get more tomatoes, but they're going to be smaller. And you might get a really, really bushy habit tomato that you don't have the air circulation that is needed. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in Tomatoes 101 is the basics. We want to introduce you folks to some of the techniques to try to get the greatest amount of production success this year from your tomato plants. I'm going to share some of the techniques that I use in my community garden. I am a community gardener. This is my 24th year in my community garden, and I like it there, and tomatoes are one of my favorites. So when we look at this, we have suckers at these main stem branching to a leaf. This one's coming off. Sucker number one's coming off. Generally, my technique is to train to 2 main stems. One main stem is the original one, and then I'm going to grab the first sucker under the first fruit cluster. It's up in the air a little bit. I will prune these lower leaves off eventually because I want air circulation underneath the plant, but then I will have production off of 2. And then going forward in the season, quite honestly, I'm going to prune all the rest of the suckers off so that I keep my plant manageable. And what I found that does is it gives me a really good amount of fruit while minimizing a lot of disease, and it makes the management of the plant a little bit easier for me. Okay, so here's a really common one. I grew like this for years. This is your basic tomato stake in the ground. You prune your suckers so you have just one main stem, because if you let all the suckers grow, eventually you get this big bush that you've tied to that stake with a big bundle of string, and that is a predisposition for high humidity and fungal disease. Remember, if you're growing super giant tomatoes, you need a super tall tomato stake. If you grow a cherry tomato plant on a 3 or 4 foot stake, it is going to outgrow that stake and start heading back down toward the ground, and it's going to make a mess out of it. So the Florida weave is a technique that's really interesting. You space stakes out where you have a stake, then you have 2 tomatoes, and a stake and 2 tomatoes, as long as your production is. This is used in high numbers of tomato plant row production, where like they got a tomato farm and they're growing hundreds and hundreds of tomatoes, and they need a way to trellis them quickly, get them off the ground with not a lot of inputs. And basically what you do is you weave the string in and out, adding a new string about every 8 inches up the plant as it grows. And that supports the plant between the stakes. Again, if you're growing tall tomatoes, you need tall stakes. And then you just run your twine, and you can do this very quickly, around 2 plants, then you crisscross, and then you go to the stake, around the stake, and then you go around the plants. It can be tricky to describe it. There's lots of really cool YouTube videos that are on there. If I was growing 100 tomatoes in my garden in a straight line, I would do the Florida weave all day long, because that would be the best method to use for that. And then this is a method that I see a lot of gardeners use, and this is sort of using some of the high tunnel and greenhouse methods outside. So this gardener has 8-foot T-post pounded in the ground, and you can't see it, but across the top there's a horizontal piece of PVC. And then the grower dangled a string down to the base of these tomato plants. So those tomatoes, as they grow, will be attached to the string. So the string is like a stake. Instead of pounding it in the ground and going up in the air, the string starts up top. And the nice thing is if you have really tall stakes, you can get this way up in the air. The attachment point that these tomatoes can get to is 8 foot tall. And believe it or not, those tomatoes over the course of the season, if properly fertilized, depending on variety, will get 8 feet tall. And this is mimicked a lot in high tunnels and greenhouses. So here's Highland Youth Garden. And if you've ever been in their wonderful greenhouse, they have horizontal supports about 12 feet tall. And where they have their raised beds, they can run string down to the base of the tomatoes. And because they're in a high tunnel, they can start them really early. This picture was taken today. And then they can run them 10, 12 feet in the air and just get tremendous amount of production out of them. In fact, if you have your string set in a way that you can move your string, like maybe you have it on a carabiner or something like that, you can make the vines go even longer, because remember, they're vines. So you can actually move the string down that line to get a little more length out of your tomatoes. And in fact, in really tall greenhouses, where they might be able to go 20 or 30 feet up, they will actually grow tomatoes over a longer season, because they have protection early in the season and protection later in the season, because they're in a greenhouse or a high tunnel, where they'll get 20-foot tall tomatoes, and the production is amazing. So here's what I use. I use cattle panel, and I use cattle panel because I used to work in the country, and cattle panel is a very common thing that way. What it is basically a galvanized fence. Really, really strong. It comes in 16-foot lengths, and it's about 4 feet tall. And I used to use it at the 4 feet tall, but my tomatoes would grow all the way up to the top, and then they would start growing across the top and heading down the other side. So I actually cut my 16-foot lengths in half, and I teepee them against each other, and so I have an 8-foot tall trellis that I grow my tomatoes on. And believe it or not, all of my tomatoes that are cherry tomatoes, or like brandywines or like big boys, all the ones that are going to grow all season long, they will get 8 feet tall. And so I want to have as much height as I can on my trellis. Make sure the take-home point here is make sure that you match the size of your trellis and your support to the size that your tomatoes are going to get to. You can get dwarf tomatoes that will be no taller than 1 foot tall, believe it or not. You can get certain bush varieties that they might only get 3 or 4 feet tall, but if you're growing some of the tomatoes that are heavy duty producing indeterminate varieties, they can get giant, and the taller your trellis is, the better you are at supporting those tomatoes up in the air and keeping them healthier so that you get production all the way through the season. All right, I'm going to bop in the chat and see what we get. All right, you go ahead, dump questions in the chat. Okay. So we have a couple questions about emails for today's flower drop. What I highly recommend you do is, Melissa is going to type her email into the chat box, and so is T, because you want to verify that you have the correct email so that they can get in touch with you. I get lots and lots of email sign-in sheets when I used to be able to go out and teach, and I used to tell folks, make sure you print with your best handwriting, because it's amazing how much a 6 might look like a G or a 3 might look like an E, and it only takes one thing to make it so that you can't get your emails. Okay, with cattle trellis, do you still sucker? Yes, I do. I train mine to 2 main stems per plant, and I take the suckers off all the other ones. And can you prune the top of the plants if they get too tall for the trellis? You can, but you might be stopping the production because the flower clusters are going to continue to develop after every 3 leaves. So if you look at your tomatoes and they're growing correctly and you have the right fertility, you'll see leaf, then leaf, then leaf, then flower cluster, then leaf, then leaf, then leaf, then flower cluster. So if you were to top your tomatoes, you have to wait for a sucker to then do production. And if you've been suckering your tomatoes the entire time, you might not have enough production. So let's talk about fertilization and watering. So tomatoes like slightly acidic soil. They would rather have it between about 6.2 and 6.8 or so. And that can be a problem here in Franklin County because we have very alkaline soils here. We got limestone bedrock, we got lots of calcium. I soil test about every 2 or 3 years in my community garden, and I'm roughly about 7.4 to 7.5. My tomatoes still do pretty good. What I try to do is add as much organic matter in as I possibly can, because compost is a miracle worker, and it is going to help your tomatoes adjust to lots of different potential problems. Realize that tomatoes are a heavy feeder, and even if you use a slow release granular fertilizer, you might need to add more, and by might, you will need to add more once, twice, maybe even 3 times over the course of the season, based on how much rainfall we get. Right? We had a 5.5-inch rainfall a couple weekends ago, and that drove a lot of fertilizer right out of the soil down into the subsoil. I highly recommend that you base your fertilizer treatments on your soil test. When you look at this soil test, I can tell you that I did this soil test. I sampled this soil, and when I harvested it, it looked amazing. It looked like the most fertile soil ever. You would have figured that if you planted a tomato in there, you'd have won the state fair. But when I got the result back, there was nothing needed to grow tomatoes. In fact, phosphorus and potassium are probably 2 of the most important nutrients for tomato growth, and these tomatoes would have done poorly. And then I tell folks, when you are irrigating your tomatoes, this is very important. Try to keep those leaves dry. And I know we just had an inch of rain, but when you're doing the watering, irrigate at the base of the tomato, because moist tomato leaves, especially with high heat, is high humidity, and that is a predisposition to disease. The way that I manage a lot of my soil moisture, and you're going to find when we get into a few more slides, most of these problems in tomatoes, believe it or not, are mitigated by the more mulch you can get around your tomatoes. I mulch heavily around my tomatoes because I want to make my soil moisture even. I don't want these big spikes of really wet to really dry to really wet to really dry. I want it to be as close to steady state as I can. That minimizes problems. So you'll see me just mulch like crazy. I took this picture this week. I have plasticulture mulch right here. That's what's this plastic right here. The plastic goes about 6 inches around the base of my tomatoes. I have heavy duty amounts of hay, 6 to 8 inches of hay mulch. Now, before I was able to put that mulch down, before I planted my tomatoes, I had to check to make sure that the soil was warm enough. We had really cold temperatures in April and May. We had temperatures in May that went down below freezing. Our last freeze date this year was May 12th. You want to know what our last freeze date was last year? April 2nd. So if you had your tomatoes in before that freeze, I saw a lot of dead tomatoes in my community garden. And keep in mind, we're talking soil temperatures when we're talking about where plants and seeds grow, because plants and seeds go in the soil. And I'm digging a deep hole, right? We talked about the way that tomatoes will grow extra roots out of the stem. So I need that soil to be warm at the bottom of the hole, so I don't rush to plant my tomatoes. Honestly, these tomatoes are huge right now, but I didn't plant them back in April. I planted them about 2 weeks ago. I waited till that soil got really warm. We have a actual soil monitoring station, and if you want to know what that is, I'll dump that into the chat box, but OARDC Weather Systems monitors soil temperatures at all of our research farms, and we have a research farm on campus at Waterman Farm. Yesterday's soil test or soil temperatures, 5 centimeters deep, which is about 2 inches, it was about 68 degrees, and at 5 inches or 10 centimeters, it was about 68.5, and that is what tomatoes love. Minimum of 60 degrees, ideally closer to 70 when you plant them. If not, you get one of what's called an abiotic problems. So we're going to talk about diseases and we're going to talk about insects, but first we're going to talk about what's known as abiotic problems. And that means problems that aren't related to pests and disease. Abiotic problems are related to things like husbandry or fertilizer or temperature or rainfall. And this is an example of an abiotic problem. This is what happens to a tomato when you plant it in soil that is too cold. Tomatoes cannot take phosphorus up when the soil is too cold. Below 60, closer to 50 degrees, they struggle. They start turning purple. So I took this picture. This was last year. We had people planting tomatoes in the ground in April, and the tomatoes were planted in soil that was too cold. And what happens is, they need phosphorus to grow. Phosphorus is one of the major macronutrients, and it helps with seedling vigor. So these tomatoes go in, they don't grow at all. They start turning funny colors. They might not catch up the entire season because they get damaged from that. So make sure when you plant your tomatoes, you don't need to rush. You do need to make sure you get them in a hole where the soil is warm enough that they're going to thrive. We had this problem a lot last year, blossom drop. If you remember what the temperature did last year, we were super wet all the way through spring. It rained constantly, 2-inch, 3-inch rain events until 4th of July. And then if you remember, the rain turned off and the heat turned on, and it went 95 degrees and didn't rain at all until Labor Day. And while tomatoes are a summer veg, most summer veg actually don't want to be smoking hot. They like their daytime temps between about 70 to 80, and they like it to go down below 70 degrees at night. When you get above that or below that, that stresses the tomatoes out, and what they'll do is they'll drop their blossoms. So I had lots of reports of this happening, and this happened to me. I took this picture. That was my tomato plant. All of those days that we had last year in July and August where it was 95 and 96, and then overnight it was 75, 76, 77. All these tomatoes stressed and they drop their blossoms. And what that means is you're going to have a long period where you're going to have minimal harvest because all of these potential fruits fell off. Here's a problem that I noticed a lot last year. I don't know if you've seen that. Last year, we might see it this year because we did have some cold nights, but this is called zipper. So this is the blossom end, or the tomato's blossom end is on the other side of the stem end, right? The stem end is where it attaches, and then when the flower gets pollinated, the tomato starts to grow past that. Sometimes when it's really cold, the flower doesn't completely detach from the tomato and it latches on. And what happens is you get a line that goes down the side of the tomato. This was a tiny attachment point for the flower that as this tomato matured, that flower held on and caused a little scar. It's pretty much a surface scar. For a grower that was trying to sell at a farmer's market, however, this is a blemish that you don't want to have on there. For the home grower, this is something that you trim off. But if you notice this in your tomatoes, it's an abiotic problem. Generally, the pollination occurred in cold and the flower had trouble letting go. Here's another flower or pollination problem. This is cat facing. If you guys ever seen this, where you get a tomato and you look at the bottom of it and it just looks like it's all gnarled up like that. This is another one that this was the blossom end, right? And we had problems with either pollination or the flower causing a problem detaching on that, usually from cold weather. A lot of this can be specific to different varieties. I see this very commonly in my big heirloom tomatoes, right? Your rainbows, your brandywines, your you know, the ones that are giant, and what happens is this is deformed because you had a flower formation or pollination problem. And the problem is these lesions can actually go really deep into the tomato, to where this tomato, if you cut it up, you're going to find that there's going to be some yucky rot all the way through that tomato. So cracking, right? Woo. Last year, early on in the season, when we were getting rain in June, you'd have tomatoes that were starting to ripen. And what happens is when it's really, really dry, and then you get tons of moisture, or it's really dry and you just watered a ton, the tomato will actually take up water so fast that it will split its skin open. And this is something that's very commonly seen after a heavy rainfall, after a dry period, and it can crack either linearly or radially, and then this can cause a problem, because once it cracks open that skin, you might get a secondary infection in there, and this is a lot of tomato that you have to prune off that way. This is a potential problem that you can mitigate with heavy duty amounts of mulch, right? We talked about how mulch minimizes those peaks and valleys of soil moisture and tries to keep it at steady state. I will say that if it is really, really dry and I got a bunch of tomatoes on the vine that are close to ripe, normally I would like to let them ripen all the way on the vine. But if we got a big thunderstorm coming up, or we know we're going to have a heavy rain, because I know that my tomatoes are going to take up that moisture no matter what I do in some cases, I will harvest them when they're close, let them ripen on the counter. And we see this more often in tomatoes that are either ripe or close to ripe, because they don't have the ability to get any bigger anymore. This is another one that's fairly common when we have super high heat and we have lots of sun on those tomatoes, and you'll see green or yellow shoulders. There's a lot of different sort of hypotheses on why this happened. It might be from drought. It might be from heat stress. We had both drought and heat stress last year in July, and I had a lot of these on my tomatoes. But I've also seen where there are some research papers that are looking at if this might be a problem of potassium in the fruit, where you might even have potassium inside the soil at adequate levels, but you have this potassium deficiency in the fruit. What I try to do for this, besides heavy duty amounts of mulch, is try to irrigate deeply periodically when it's in a drought state, so that I don't have that really, really bad dry moisture situation. And I try to maintain a decent amount of leaf cover. I mean, I'm doing pruning to make sure I have air circulation, but I want to have enough leaf cover to cover my tomatoes so that they don't get that, that stress from too much sun. And then how many people have seen this one? Blossom end rot. This is a very common one. What this is a deficiency of calcium in the fruit, okay? Because calcium is not mobile in the plant. You guys have seen where you have a plant and if you don't have enough nitrogen in there, what happens is the lower leaves on the plant start to turn yellow. They were green originally, but then they start to turn yellow. And the reason is nitrogen is movable in the plant. The plant will take it out of the old leaves and it'll stick it in the new leaves to make green ones. Calcium is not that way. So what happens with blossom end rot is you have a deficiency of calcium in the fruit. A lot of times that is related to soil moisture. You might have not enough soil moisture for the sort of the plant to feed calcium into the tip of that root, or it might rain so fast and so hard that during the transpiration of that plant, it might not be able to deliver that calcium because of the movement within it. It also can affect peppers and eggplant. You want to, one, make sure that you have enough calcium in your soil. And if you're growing in regular old Franklin County dirt, you do, because we are built on a limestone bedrock. But if you filled up a container or you filled up your raised bed, maybe you use some bag soil or you got some soil trucked in, make sure that you do a soil test so you know you have adequate calcium, because if you don't have enough in the soil, you might have blossom end rot as well. All right. This is a good segue to jump into the chat box. Oh gosh, I hope I didn't stop the video. I would be sad as sad can be. Teresa and Melissa, I'm sure you guys didn't. We'll cross our fingers. We still got video, gang. So how can you keep temp down in a high tunnel on days where temp hits 90? Will fans circulating the air help for blossom drop? Yes, it will. You want to have air movement in there. So fans on either side with good ventilation, roll up the sides so you get air movement. Can you talk about fertilizing and above ground watering through heavy mulch? So when I do, yes, you can use liquid fertilizer. That's one way, that if you irrigate with fertilizer in it, you're delivering that fertilization all the way into the roots. But when I top dress another batch of slow release granular fertilizer, I do move the mulch out of the way briefly. So I scatter it in that top of the soil, not just on top of the mulch. And get that down in there. So how can we add calcium to our soil fertilizer? Yes, there are calcium heavy fertilizers you can use, calcium nitrate. You could use bone meal. That's an organic heavy duty calcium supplement. Any number of fertilizers are going to come with calcium in it. Be a label reader with your fertilizers. Yes, you can add eggshells for calcium. I add all my eggshells into my compost pile, and then I mulch with compost and mix compost in the hole as well. Will there be an opportunity for members to get our hands on some garden seeds? I would recommend that you contact Melissa and T offline to get the details on any seeds or drops to make sure that you have your email correctly in there. Can you talk about the big green worms? Yes, I have big green worm slides coming up. You are right on top of it. So let's talk for a few minutes about diseases and insects, because tomatoes are one of the big three families that gets lots of diseases and lots of insects. The number one disease grouping that they get is fungal disease. Think septoria, leaf spot, think early blight, think late blight. All of these are fungal diseases that can be devastating in plantings. That's why we talk about lots of integrated pest management techniques. They also get viral diseases. They also get bacterial diseases. In fact, tomatoes have hundreds of diseases that they get. So when I do talks about diseases in tomatoes, I don't generally concentrate on the disease, or we would be here for a week because there's that many of them. I talk about how do we prevent disease in tomatoes instead of necessarily try to cure it, because it can be very difficult to cure. By the time you see fungal disease on your plant, or viral disease or bacterial disease on your plant, you might have millions and millions of organisms on there because you can't see those. They're very, very small. So I use what's known as integrated pest management, IPM strategies, to try to minimize the disease risk, knowing that, quite honestly, tomatoes aren't from here. It's tough to keep them alive in Ohio. They did not originate here. We grow them as annuals here because we really like eating tomatoes, but there's lots of diseases they get. IPM strategies that I use are mulch. We've been talking about that. You guys are probably sick of me saying the word mulch by now. Then I crop rotate. I try to make sure that I'm not growing plants in the same family in the same spot with a 3-year time lag in between them. If you take a look at this picture, this is my friends that grow in my same community garden. They put their tomatoes in the exact same spot every single year. There's no mulch whatsoever. A lot of these fungal spores that cause these blights live in the soil. And when you have that heavy pounding rain, or if you overhead irrigate and you splash these up on the leaves, that's where you start to see the lowest leaves of the tomatoes start to turn yellow and get brown spots and then turn brown and fall off. So heavy duty amounts of mulch keep the spores from splashing up onto the plants. And then I make sure that I soil test and address fertility, right? A strong, healthy tomato that has enough fertilizer to grow is going to do better in terms of how it is going to resist the bacterial, viral, or fungal diseases. I add lots of organic matter to my soil as much as I can for the same reason. There are pesticides that you can use. There are fungicides that can be sprayed on these plants, but it can be difficult if you have millions of fungal organisms to really make a difference in that plant, although a lot of folks use them with a lot of success. And then keep in mind that when you're selecting your tomatoes, if you have certain problems that you get all the time, I every year put about 15 tomatoes in my community garden, but not 15 of the same variety. I put about 6 different varieties. Some of them are heirlooms, some of them are cherry tomatoes, some of them have hybrid resistance. I want to make sure I have variety, and I want to make sure that I have different types in there so that I get a harvest. Like this year, I intentionally put 2 heat-tolerant varieties in my rotation because last year it went to 95 degrees. I want to make sure I get tomatoes, so I added something in there. There's several insects that tomatoes get. The big green worm is a hornworm. That's the one that we see periodically in there. I have some great pictures I'm going to share on hornworms. And then there's an insect called the tomato fruit worm. It's the same insect that is the corn earworm. And I do see that sometimes, and what that does is it eats like a circular hole in the tomato that can be like a ½ inch or an inch deep. Aphids are a problem on tomatoes sometimes. Stink bugs are a definite problem on tomatoes because they'll stick their little sucker in the tomatoes and they'll feed and they'll cause a really nasty little lesion that extends deep in the tomatoes. And then flea beetles. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but this has been the worst year for flea beetles that I can remember in my garden for years and years and years. Normally I worry about them with my eggplant or I worry about them with my arugula, but this year they were eating turnips, they were eating radishes, they ate my tomatoes. It was amazing. This was the worst year that I had for flea beetles. Sanitation is one of the critical things, okay? So you guys all know what your tomato patch looks like at the end of the year. You're sick of gardening, you've been fighting off the mosquitoes for 6-8 months. Your tomatoes are starting to get the blight and die. A lot of pests and diseases are getting there no matter what you do, and that's normal. My whole process with tomatoes is I know I can't protect it forever. I want to protect it as long as I can to get as much harvest as I can. But what I try to make sure that I do is every year I want to clean up the tomato patch as best as I can. I want to get every remnant of plant. I want to get all the leaves. I want to pull all the roots. I want to get all the fruit off. And that is not compost because that is diseased almost all the time. That is garbage. I don't put that in my compost. I'm a cold composter and I put my compost on everything and it goes into all my container gardens. So I pitch that stuff. And then I crop rotate to a different part of my garden. So we talked about bugs and we want to talk about the big green worm. So here's a tomato hornworm. Whenever I am talking to a client about bugs, I always say, before you just squish it, identify it. Is it a good bug or is it a bad bug? Because believe it or not, you have some friends in your garden that are trying to help you. And if you just kill every bug that you see, you might kill a good bug. So on the left is a tomato hornworm sitting on a fence post. They don't normally pose like that. I stuck them there for a picture. That is a bad bug. That hornworm did not live long after that picture. Let me just say that. On the right is a tomato hornworm with a bunch of white egg cases on it. Those are beneficial parasitic wasp egg cases, meaning that when those eggs hatch, the little baby wasps will drill into that hornworm and eat it from the inside out. In fact, they've already paralyzed it, so it can't feed. And hornworms can feed like crazy. They will eat half of your tomato plant. So if you killed that, you would kill hundreds of beneficial parasitic wasps that want to do nothing more than hatch, fly into your garden, and help you get a tomato harvest. So make sure that you identify your hornworms. And it's interesting because I've had multiple questions, you know, where people say, I saw the hornworm and then it was gone. I'm looking for their chrysalis. And what they do is they fall off on the ground and they form their chrysalis and they turn into a beautiful giant mothy butterfly that's like huge. I was digging through my old tomato patch this year, getting it ready to do a different planting, and I dug this guy up. This is what the chrysalis of a tomato hornworm looks like, and it is bigger than my thumb. That is a full-size thick Sharpie that it is right next to. It was half the size of that. It was buried in the soil because when they fall off, they go in the ground, they spin their chrysalis before they hatch. So there is a bad bug right there, and that's the first time I've actually found one in a long time. I pulled him out, and when I was going to take this picture, it was wiggling. It was very gross. So I want to introduce you to my friend Reggie. I did a farm tour out in Madison County, and if you look, you'll see there's a hornworm that is right in there. And boy, don't they have great camouflage in there. Well, this farmer had trained his Labrador, Reggie, to be an integrated pest management specialist, ultimate and organic. Reggie. Reggie didn't harm a single cherry tomato. I watched Reggie eat about 8 hornworms, and I'm a veterinarian, and I'm not sure that that's probably in the best interest for that dog. But I also saw Reggie eat most of a log and half of a rat, so that was not even by far one of the top 2 worst things that he ate that night. There's a lot of other ways that people do tomato production, and if you're unaware of it, Ohio is actually huge in hydroponic tomato production. We're one of the top 5 states in hydroponic growing. Most of it is not in central Ohio, so we're not really as aware of it. But agricultural industry is the #1 business in Ohio, and we have a huge hydroponic operation. But one of the things that's really, really fun is you can grow tomatoes in your office. So this was my office last year before we moved, and this is the dead of winter. I had one of those indoor hydroponics, and this is what they've done with some hybrids. This is a dwarf tomato plant. It got no bigger than about 8 inches tall, but I ate cherry tomatoes all winter. So when you think about ways that you can grow outside, realize that there might be a few cool ways that you can grow inside as well. We have a tremendous amount of resources for you in Extension to assist you with growing tomatoes. I'm going to type into the chat box the link to Growing Franklin, and I'm going to share a screen on that. We have a great fact sheet on Ohio Line that you can look up as well. On the right is what happens if you type tomatoes into the search function of Growing Franklin. Last year, it's pretty cool. You can timeline it. 1, it was too cold and people's tomatoes had phosphorus deficiency. And then in June, it was doing nothing but rain and rain and rain. And so I did a post on keeping tomatoes healthy in wet weather. And then when it went to July, it went 95, and all of a sudden we had to keep them alive in hot weather. But we have lots of great information on there. I'm going to dump the links and show you what I mean in the chat box here shortly. So I'm going to stop share. I am going to, don't you worry, I'm going to go into the chat box here in just a second, and I'm going to answer questions. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to pull up a different screen share of, where are you? Where are you? Right here, this guy. So this is Growing Franklin, and I will put the website URL in there. I highly recommend you visit. I highly recommend you subscribe, because when I add content, subscribers get emails right away. But this is the site that I maintain for local food production, and we have all kind of different classes that we offer on that. I just did a composting class in partnership with Franklinton Farms, and I recorded that webinar and put it on there. Something cool that you can look at. When I do classes such as this one, I'll put the information on here with the Zoom registration links. Save the date. We have a class coming up in partnership with Charles Madison Neighborhood Memorial Garden for a virtual summer garden walk. That is July 9th, Thursday. I have not put the website post on that yet, but I will. All right, so I'm going to jump into the chat. I'm going to oh, you guys, okay, here we go. Can you talk about big green worms? We did that. Does compost promote various bacterial diseases? I have not found that it does that. Compost and increasing organic matter in the soil promotes the health of the plant, and a healthy plant is much more likely to fight off bacterial, viral, or fungal disease. What other types of mulch would you suggest other than straw? So you have choices for organic or non-organic. So organic ones, people will use straw. I like hay. It can be trickier to get. Shredded leaves work okay. Dried lawn clippings work okay as long as you make sure your lawn isn't treated. I use compost as a mulch as well. In terms of inorganic mulches, I like plasticulture, but the kind I use is a woven mat that's like a thick landscape mat, and it's woven, which means it lets moisture and oxygen move through it, and that way it doesn't sort of turn into that anaerobic smelly soil underneath it. Is spinosad rainproof if you use the pesticide dust? Maybe. It is important to read, understand, and follow the label on all pesticides so that you know how it should best be applied in terms of temperature, moisture, or frequency. Can fungal remain in straw from previous years? Yeah, it might. It might at that, quite honestly. If there's a lot of fungal spores shed onto that straw, it could potentially be in there. I worry about the dye in Scott's brown mulch. Are there any chemicals in the mulch that I need to worry about transferring into the produce? I don't know. I recommend that if you're using a specific product from a specific company, that you would contact them to get the what's known as SDS or safety data sheet about their product, and they can tell you more about that. I don't generally use like a hardwood mulch in my vegetable garden, although I would use it in my container gardens because I rototill. Well, the city rototills my community garden, and I don't want those big chunks of wood in there. But with my container garden, I can just pull them off. Baking soda, Spike shared a baking soda. Google for the recipe. Are there any type of conventional pesticides that would work on flea beetles but not pollinators? The key, yeah, flea beetles are horrible this year. So the key with pesticide use is to be very, very safe with its use, because all pollinators are bigger sissies than all of the bad bugs. So like if I was using a pesticide on my eggplant to kill flea beetles, the minute I see flowers start to develop, I have to stop. Because if I don't, I'm going to kill the pollinators, and then I'm not going to get a harvest. So the key is that you would use your pesticides wisely. And like I said, believe it or not, it is the law to read, understand, and follow the label on all pesticides. And then Bonnie has reported that all the flowers are gone from Casa Street Garden already. Okay. What do I do about stink bugs? You know, there's not great stuff that you can do about stink bugs because they're feeding on the fruit and they're not on there all the time. What I try to do is try to hand pick them as best as I can for stink bugs. I kind of classify stink bugs the same in that stink bugs, squash bugs, cucumber beetles, they're devastating pests and they can really wreck your plantings. They're fairly resistant to a bunch of pesticides, plus they're always around when you have flowers. So you really have to be creative when you're coming up with strategies to take care of them. Grass clippings can be used for mulch. I recommend that you let them dry out first, because if you put them around when they're wet, they can kind of turn into a mat. And then if you use grass clippings that have had any kind of weed and feed, weed preventative on it, generally those things persist in the clippings and they can devastate your plantings because they'll release into your veggies. Way off topic, how can I keep cats from using my beds as a litter box? Believe it or not, heavy amounts of mulch will do that, and then bird netting does that as well. And then Elaine recommends rocks or sticks on the soil between plants. Yeah, they can't dig in that. Victoria, I don't know what castle soap is, so I can't assist you on that, but there are a number of what's known as horticultural soaps that are out there. I have an anthill coming up in my garden. I have an anthill coming up in my garden too. I'm not doing anything about it because they're not really feeding or messing with my plants. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep close eye on it to make sure that they don't mess with my plants. And then if I need to use an ant bait, I would have to make sure that it's something that does not affect pollinators and would have minimal effect on beneficial bugs, because the last thing I want to do is spread some sort of pesticide on my garden that is going to make the good bugs go away. Thoughts on chipmunk control? I use bird netting, gang. I will be very frank that nuisance wildlife is one of the bane of my existences. Deer, bunnies, groundhogs, squirrels, chipmunks, you name it. Generally, a mechanical barrier works good. Bird netting works well for all of them except for chipmunks. Chipmunks will just blow right through it like it's not even there. Victoria, contact me offline so we can talk about that soap, because I still have no idea. I've never heard of that. Yeah, so I knock stink bugs and squash bugs into a jar or small bucket with a bit of soap bubbles on it. That's, believe it or not, hand picking works pretty good. If you can get over the fact that they're actually big bugs and sometimes they fly around and smack you in the forehead. You guys are full of great questions today. So I will say this, if you have not gotten your soap if you have not gotten your tomatoes in the ground, you still have tons of time to get your tomatoes in the ground. I've gotten emails several times from people that have asked me, is it too late to plant tomatoes because they planted them and they had some injury from weed killer on their lawn, or a deer came by and chomped the top 6 inches off. The key is, we're early in the season. We have great soil temperature right now. And so, yes, you have time and you can get your tomatoes in the ground still. And so I've had some offline folks mention Castile soap. I'll be honest, I am unfamiliar with it, but I am going to make a effort to learn about that. So Tim, will you address the difference between horticulture soap and regular soap? Yeah, so soap is a really interesting thing. And if you were ever try to give yourself a headache, try to figure out exactly how soap works at breaking covalent bonds and things to do stuff on what it does. The key is a horticultural soap is made to not cause damage to the plants, where you might find that if you use a soap that isn't designed to minimize that it might actually cause damage to a plant. There's a lot of online recommendations for a lot of products that are homeopathic products, or folks will mix other things. And I'll be super honest, I really can't speak to them. The reason is, out of the Ohio State University, my job is to really only radiate research-based facts and products and things like that. So a lot of folks will ask me, what do I think about other things? Until I have a chance to actually kind of review the literature and the research, I tell folks that, I mean, you use what you're comfortable using. I'm not the tomato police, and the nice thing is, there is nobody who is going to tell you what to do, or at least I hope there's not. Okay. So Danielle asked about a second meeting. How do I proceed to get a card? So I didn't see the form to download on Facebook. That is an excellent question. So you go on to Growing Franklin, and on the Tomatoes 101 post, what I did was I actually put the GCGC membership form on it. You can click on that and print it, or you can click on this link, and what it does is it will pull up a printable PDF, and what you can do then is fill that out. Don't mail it to me. I won't know what to do with it whatsoever. Make sure you send that to where it needs to go. But let me put the link on that. There you go, gang. All right. We got a question. My tomatoes are planted on top of a solid clay cap and gravel in a raised bed, about 10 inches of soil. What are the odds of my harvest being a success this year? I would say that tomatoes are fairly laterally rooted. So if you make sure that, since you don't have a great volume of soil, make sure that you don't plant your tomatoes too close together, or else they're going to compete because they can't really go deep. Make sure you have adequate fertility in there because they're going to be producing over a long time period. Make sure you add as much organic matter as you can in there because that's going to assist with holding on to moisture, right? Because your soil holds on to your water and it holds on to your fertilizer. So the more soil you have, the more water and the more fertilizer you can have held on. And a nice heavy layer of mulch is going to do well at trying to minimize your water loss. So suggestions for deer repellents or sprays. I don't have a suggestion on an individual one. I will say this, the best solution for deer is fence. Repellents can kind of work. You have to rotate them and you have to monitor very quickly in terms of how long they're going to persist on the plantings in terms of rainfall. One product that I've used that was really, really cool and worked really, really well was this 9-volt battery motion detector hose sprayer thing where you put a 9-volt battery in it and you run your hose into it and you turn it on. And when it senses something walking by, it starts spraying water all over it. And that was very effective and it was gentle and it watered at the same time. And it was not expensive. I got it on Amazon, although I don't remember exactly which one I got. It looked like a bird. It was funny. The problem was the deer would learn exactly how far the water would get sprayed and they would eat right on the outside of the radius. So you even have to move that periodically. Deer are very persistent. They know you guys are good gardeners and you are raising what they want to eat, which is food. So they're going to spend all night trying to figure out how to eat it. So yes, container tomatoes, you can grow tomatoes in containers. You make sure that you size your container to the plant at maturity, okay? If you have only a moderate sized container, get a variety that is labeled for container growth. The beauty of container gardening nowadays is all of the various plant growers and seed manufacturers realize that lots of people grow in containers, and what they do is they've hybrided varieties that do well in containers. So if you pick a variety that does well in containers, you are going to have a way higher chance of success. Now, you can grow a giant tomato plant. You need a giant container because remember what we were just talking about. The soil holds the water, the soil holds the fertilizer. You need lots of soil to grow a giant plant. Okay. All right, Annika. So everybody that registered and then came into here, I will have those emails and I will share that with Teresa and Melissa so that we have a record. So this can be your class that you use in order to sign up. It's 7:59. We got room for another question or two before I actually head to my garden and check it out. I haven't been there all day.
Oh my. Tim, I have a question for you.
Certainly, and I want to give Teresa and Melissa a chance as the hostesses with the mostesses to bring us home and some final words out of GCGC.
Because I'm asking this question because the Wallace Garden is a victory garden, correct? An original victory garden. So yep. I came across this picture and I wondered which person you are in this picture.
Is there a super tall? Oh, yep, there. I'm right in the front. That'd be I'm Superman. Yep, right in the front. Yeah. The buff one. I've been working out. Yeah. Is he holding cabbage? I'm more cabbage than pepper. I like it.
We figured you must be Superman.
Yes.
Because you give super video information on the gardens, and we appreciate it so much. And I know all of our members, all of our GCGC members who have watched this love it. We get a lot of comments about all your things that you do. It's great.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to do this again. I will work with T and Melissa. If you guys have any thoughts on classes that you would like to have, feel free to send it those ideas to all of us, and maybe for another meeting we'll do another virtual like this one. I want to say we had about 89 people at the highest amount earlier, and that's a great turnout.
It is.
And so I appreciate everybody showing up, and everybody stay safe, and I hope your gardens grow and get giant and productive. And if you have any questions about growing your tomatoes, email me. If you have any questions about GCGC, or you want to join, or you want to find out more about drops or all the great things that they do in the community, how to get some seeds, continuing education classes, contact Teresa Martin and Melissa Fannin and they will help you with all of your GCGC related questions.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
My pleasure.
All right, bye-bye.
All right, see you guys.
Have fun.